The afternoon sun hung low over Riverside, California, on October 12, 1984, casting long shadows across the modest suburban streets where children rode bikes and mothers called their families home for dinner. It was a Friday, the kind of day that promised weekend freedom to the 13 and 14-year-olds of Lincoln Junior High School. 3 boys walked together that afternoon, their backpacks slung over shoulders, their voices carrying on the autumn breeze. To anyone watching, they were just neighborhood kids, taking their time, getting home. Friends. Inseparable, some would say. Jerry Mitchell was 13, with sandy hair that perpetually fell into his eyes, and a nervous habit of cracking his knuckles. Manuel Gutierrez, 14, was the tallest of the 3, already showing the broad shoulders of the man he would become. He spoke sparingly, observing the world through dark, calculating eyes that made him seem older than his years. And then there was Spence Fredrick, also 13 but 3 months younger than Jerry, who filled every silence with chatter, jokes, and observations about everything from comic books to the girls in their math class. They lived within a stone's throw of each other on Maple Drive, attended the same school just 6 minutes away, and had known each other since elementary school. Their mothers traded casseroles. Their fathers nodded to each other over lawnmowers on Saturday mornings. This was the fabric of American suburban life, woven tight with routine and trust. That Friday, as the final bell rang at 3:15 p.m., the 3 boys made a decision that would shatter 3 families and haunt a community for more than 2 decades. Instead of taking their usual route home down Maple Street, they decided to follow the old trail that ran behind the neighborhood, the one that wound past the stream everyone called Willow Creek. It wasn't forbidden exactly, but parents didn't love the idea. The creek could swell after rain, and there were spots where the banks grew steep and treacherous. But October had been dry. The stream was running low and clear. And the boys were 13 and 14, old enough, they thought, to make their own choices about the long way home. No one saw them turn down that trail. No one witnessed what happened in the next hour. And for 23 years, only 2 people on Earth knew the truth. Sally Fredrick noticed the kitchen clock as she stirred the pot of chili on the stove. 5:47 p.m. Spence should have been home by now. She felt the first flutter of maternal concern but pushed it down. Boys lost track of time. They got caught up in conversations or stopped to look at something interesting. She'd give him until 6 o'clock. At 6 p.m. exactly, she walked to the front window and looked down Maple Drive. Empty. She called upstairs to her husband, James. "Have you seen Spence?" James Fredrick, a postal worker with a meticulous nature, came down the stairs with his reading glasses still perched on his nose. "He's not home yet?" "No." The flutter had become a grip. By 6:15, James was walking up and down the block, calling Spence's name. By 6:30, he'd knocked on Jerry Mitchell's door. Mrs. Mitchell answered with her own son beside her. Jerry, still in his school clothes, looked up at Mr. Fredrick with wide eyes. "Is Spence with you?" James asked. Jerry shook his head. "We walked part way home together, but then we split up. I came straight home." His voice was steady, but his hands, James would remember years later, were trembling slightly. "What about Manuel? He went home too, I think. We all went our separate ways." At Manuel Gutierrez's house, the response was similar. Manuel stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, and told Mr. Fredrick he'd last seen Spence near the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, heading home. That was around 3:45, maybe 4 o'clock. By 7 p.m., Sally Fredrick was on the phone with the Riverside Sheriff's Department, her voice breaking as she described her son. 5'2", about 95 pounds, brown hair, wearing a blue windbreaker and jeans, carrying a black Jansport backpack with a torn right strap. Deputy Thomas Carver took the call. A missing child. Every law enforcement officer's nightmare. He knew the statistics the first few hours were critical. Most kids turned up quickly, but when they didn't, he tried not to think about when they didn't. By 8 p.m., half the neighborhood was out searching. Flashlights bobbed through backyards and along the streets. Voices called Spence into the growing darkness. Jerry Mitchell and his father joined the search. So did Manuel Gutierrez, walking silently beside his mother, his eyes scanning the shadows. 10-year-old Mabel Fredrick sat on her front porch steps, hugging her knees, watching the organized chaos swirl around her. Where was her brother? Just that morning, he'd stolen the last of the frosted flakes, and she'd called him a jerk. Now she'd give anything to hear him laugh and tell her she was being a baby. The search continued through the night. Deputy Carver organized volunteers into grid patterns, covering every street, every yard, every park within a 2-mile radius. They checked the school, the arcade downtown, the 7-Eleven where the kids sometimes bought candy. Nothing. As dawn broke on Saturday morning, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that felt obscene given the circumstances, James and Sally Fredrick faced a horrifying reality. Their son had vanished without a trace. Detective Linda Vasquez caught the case on Saturday morning. A 15-year veteran of the Riverside Sheriff's Department, she'd worked missing persons before, but children always hit differently. She had a daughter, Spence's age. She started where all good investigations start, with the last people to see the victim alive. Jerry Mitchell sat across from her in the Fredrick living room, his parents beside him, his leg bouncing nervously. Vasquez kept her voice gentle. "Jerry, I need you to walk me through yesterday afternoon. Every detail you can remember." Jerry's story was consistent with what he'd told Mr. Fredrick the night before. They'd left school together, the three of them. They'd walked and talked about normal stuff, a science test coming up, weekend plans. Around the corner of Maple and 3rd, they'd gone their separate ways. He'd come straight home, arrived around 3:45. His mom could confirm that. She did. Did Spence seem upset about anything? Worried? No, ma'am. He was normal. You know, talking a lot like he always does. Jerry's eyes filled with tears. "He's gonna be okay, right?" Vasquez didn't answer. She moved on to Manuel. Manuel Gutierrez was harder to read. He sat very still in his family's modest living room, his hands folded in his lap, his expression neutral. His story matched Jerry's almost exactly. Too exactly, perhaps, Vasquez thought. But then again, the boys had been together. Their stories should match. "You boys are close?" she asked. "We're friends," Manuel said. "Not best friends. Not like brothers. Just friends." "And there were no arguments yesterday? No disagreements?" "No, ma'am. Spence wasn't upset about anything? Not that I noticed." Vasquez studied him. Most 14-year-olds fidgeted during police interviews, even when they had nothing to hide. Manuel sat perfectly still, maintaining eye contact, answering questions in a measured tone. "Mature for his age," his mother had said. "Always has been." Over the next week, the investigation expanded. Detectives interviewed teachers, classmates, neighbors. They learned that Spence was well-liked, a B student, no behavioral problems. The three boys, Jerry, Manuel, and Spence, had been friends since 4th grade, though friends might have been too strong a word. They hung out because they lived close to each other, because proximity creates relationships in suburban neighborhoods. But teachers noticed that Jerry and Manuel had grown closer in recent months, while Spence sometimes seemed like the third wheel. Still, there'd been no obvious conflict, no dramatic falling out. Search parties combed the area for days. Divers checked the reservoir 3 miles away. Police brought in tracking dogs who followed Spence's scent from the school but lost it near the intersection of Maple and 3rd, exactly where the boys said they'd separated. Deputy Carver, working the case alongside Vasquez, kept returning to one detail: the backpack. Spence had been wearing a distinctive black Jansport with a torn right strap. Kids didn't just disappear without their backpacks. If he'd run away, he would have taken it. If he'd been abducted, it would have been left behind somewhere. But there was no backpack. No trace of Spence Fredrick at all. 2 weeks into the investigation, Detective Vasquez sat in her car outside Lincoln Junior High, watching kids stream out at the end of the day. She saw Jerry and Manuel walking together, heading toward home. Jerry was talking animatedly, gesturing with his hands. Manuel walked beside him, listening, occasionally nodding. Something about the scene bothered her. 2 boys whose best friend had vanished, walking home from school like nothing had happened. But what did she expect? Kids were resilient. Life went on, didn't it? She followed them at a distance, watching as they took the direct route home down Maple Street, never deviating, never looking toward the trail that led to Willow Creek. That night, Vasquez pulled out the case file and reviewed every interview, every statement, every scrap of evidence. On a legal pad, she wrote 3 words: check the creek. The search of Willow Creek took place on a gray November morning, 3 weeks after Spence's disappearance. Detective Vasquez stood on the bank, watching the search and rescue team work their way downstream. The creek was shallow here, barely knee-deep, flowing over smooth stones and through stands of cattails. Jerry Mitchell's mother had mentioned, almost in passing, that the boys sometimes talked about the creek. A nice spot. Scenic. Had they gone there that day? When Vasquez asked Jerry directly, he'd shaken his head. No, we didn't go to the creek. We've gone there before, but not that day. We just went straight home. Manuel said the same thing, but Vasquez had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts said, check the creek. The search team found nothing. No backpack, no clothing, no sign that Spence Fredrick had ever been near the water. The creek flowed into the Santa Ana River about a mile downstream, and divers checked the confluence, but the October currents would have carried anything or anyone much farther by now. Possibly all the way to the ocean, 40 miles away. The case began to shift. If not an accident at the creek, then what? Abduction seemed most likely. Detective Vasquez began looking at registered sex offenders in the area, at suspicious vehicles reported near the school, at any case that might connect to a stranger taking a child. But there was never any evidence of that either. No witnesses, no suspicious activity, nothing. By Christmas 1984, the investigation had stalled. The Fredrick family held a candlelight vigil. News cameras filmed Sally Fredrick's tearful plea for information. Any information about her missing son. James stood beside her, his arm around his wife, his face haggard. Little Mabel, now 11, held a sign with Spence's school picture on it. Have you seen me? Jerry Mitchell attended the vigil with his family. He cried openly. Manuel Gutierrez stood in the back of the crowd, his face solemn, his hands in his pockets. Detective Vasquez watched them both. Years passed. The investigation into Spence Fredrick's disappearance remained officially open but practically dormant. New detectives rotated through, reviewed the file, found no new leads. The case joined the heartbreaking ranks of unsolved missing children cases. A file box in a storage room, a family's unending grief, a community's unanswered questions. Jerry Mitchell graduated from high school in 1989-9. He'd become quieter over the years, more withdrawn. He went to community college, dropped out after a semester, worked retail jobs. His mother worried about him. He had nightmares. she told friends. Sometimes she heard him crying in his room late at night. Manuel Gutierrez also graduated in 1989-9. He'd done well in school, earned a scholarship to UC Riverside, majored in business administration. He was successful, focused, ambitious. He dated a girl named Christina through college, married her in 1995. They had their first child, a son, in 1997. The Fredrick family never moved from Maple Drive. James said they needed to be there in case Spence came home. In case he'd been taken, kept somewhere, and managed to escape, he'd come home, and they needed to be there. Sally created a small memorial in Spence's room, keeping it exactly as he'd left it that October morning in 1984. Blue comforter, posters of Star Wars and Michael Jackson, a stack of comic books on the nightstand. Mabel grew up in the shadow of her missing brother. She became a psychologist, specializing in trauma and grief. She never married. On the anniversary of Spence's disappearance every year, she visited the spot on Maple and 3rd where he was last reliably seen, or so everyone believed. Detective Linda Vasquez retired in 2002. The Spence Fredrick case haunted her entire career. She'd worked hundreds of cases, solved most of them, but the ones that stayed with her were always the failures, the children who never came home. She kept a copy of Spence's school picture in her desk drawer, and on her last day of work, she slipped it into her purse. She couldn't leave him behind completely. In 2004, James Fredrick died of a heart attack at age 62. The death certificate listed cardiac arrest, but everyone who knew him understood. He died of a broken heart. Sally died 2 years later, cancer. Officially, though grief had weakened her long before the disease took hold. Mabel Fredrick was orphaned at 32, her parents taken by sorrow as surely as her brother had been taken by... what? She still didn't know. Nobody did. Jerry Mitchell turned 33 in 2004. He was living in a small apartment in San Bernardino, working as a night manager at a grocery store, drinking too much, sleeping too little. He hadn't spoken to Manuel Gutierrez in years. They'd drifted apart after high school, their shared past too heavy to carry together. On the night of October 12, 2007, 23 years to the day after Spence Fredrick disappeared, Jerry sat alone in his apartment with a bottle of whiskey and a loaded gun. He'd been building to this for years. The nightmares had never stopped. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Spence's face, heard the splash, watched the blue windbreaker disappear beneath the surface of Willow Creek. He'd been 13 years old and too terrified to speak. Then 14, and the lie had calcified. 15, and telling the truth meant destroying his own life. 16, 18, 21, 30. How do you confess to burying a secret for 30 years? How do you explain that you watched your friend die and said nothing while his parents slowly perished from grief? Jerry put the barrel of the gun in his mouth. His finger trembled on the trigger. Then he thought of Mabel Fredrick, alone in the world, still searching for answers. He thought of Detective Vasquez, probably retired by now, who'd looked at him with those sharp, knowing eyes. He thought of Spence, who'd been loud and annoying and alive, who'd probably said something stupid in those last moments, who'd reached out his hand and Jerry had been too frozen with fear to grab it. He put the gun down. He picked up the phone. His hands shook so badly he could barely dial. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department received the call at 11:47 p.m. The dispatcher, who took it immediately, patched it through to the detective on duty. "My name is Jerry Mitchell," the voice on the line said. "I need to confess to something that happened 23 years ago." Detective Marcus Webb had seen the name Spence Fredrick in the cold case files. Every detective in the department knew about the kid who'd vanished in 1984. Webb was only 8 years old when it happened, But he remembered the news coverage, the search parties, the way his own mother had held him a little tighter for weeks afterward. Now he sat across from Jerry Mitchell in an interview room, a recorder running between them, and listened to the story that had festered for 23 years. "We did go to the creek that day," Jerry began, his voice hollow. "The three of us. It was Manuel's idea. He wanted to see if the water was low enough to cross to the other side, where there's this cool spot under the willows. We'd been there before in summer." He paused, swallowing hard. Spence was being Spence, talking nonstop, going on about this girl he liked, about some movie he wanted to see. Manuel kept telling him to shut up, but Spence just laughed it off. He didn't take it seriously. He never took anything seriously. Detective Webb waited. He'd learned that silence was often the best interrogation technique. Let them fill it. "We got to this one spot where the bank is kinda high, maybe 6 feet above the water. There's a big flat rock there. We were standing on it, and Spence was still talking, and Manuel just snapped." Jerry's eyes filled with tears. He pushed him, just put both hands on Spence's chest and shoved. It wasn't that hard, honestly, but Spence wasn't expecting it. He fell backward, arms flailing, and went into the water. There was this splash, and then what? He didn't come up right away. The water's not deep there, maybe 4 feet, but the current was stronger than it looked, and I think he hit his head on something when he fell. A rock, maybe, because when he did surface, he was just floating, face down. The current was taking him. Jerry covered his face with his hands. "I wanted to jump in. I swear to God I wanted to help him, but I was frozen. And Manuel grabbed my arm and said, 'Don't. It's too late. He's already gone.' And then he said, 'If we tell anyone, they'll think we killed him on purpose. They'll send us to prison. We have to keep quiet. We have to act like we split up before the creek.' And you agreed?" "I was 13. Jerry's voice rose anguished. "I was a kid, and my friend was telling me we'd go to prison if we told the truth. So we watched Spence float downstream until we couldn't see him anymore. Then we walked back to the trail and went home like nothing happened. We promised each other we'd never tell anyone. Never." Detective Webb leaned forward. "Why are you telling me now?" Jerry laughed bitterly. "Because I can't do it anymore. I can't carry it. I was going to kill myself tonight, but I thought, Spence's family deserves to know. They deserve to bury him, if there's anything left to bury. And Manuel just went on with his life, got married, had kids, like nothing ever happened. He murdered Spence because that's what it was. Murder, and he's just fine. You think it was intentional? I don't know. Maybe not at first. But leaving him there, letting him drown or bleed out or whatever happened, making me promise to never tell, that was intentional. That was a choice." The interview lasted 4 hours. Jerry told them everything, the exact location where they'd gone into the creek, where Spence had fallen in, the direction the current had taken him. He described the backpack, confirmed it had gone into the water with Spence. He wept. He apologized over and over to a ghost and to a family he'd helped destroy. When it was over, Detective Webb asked the question that mattered most. "Are you willing to testify against Manuel Gutierrez?" Jerry Mitchell looked him in the eye. "Yes. That's why I'm here." The arrest of Manuel Gutierrez made national news. "Man arrested in cold case death of childhood friend," read the headlines. After 23 years, answers had finally come. Manuel was 38 years old, a successful regional manager for a telecommunications company, living in a nice house in Corona with his wife Christina and their 2 teenage children. When detectives knocked on his door at 6 a.m. on October 15th, 2007, his first words were, "I knew this day would come eventually. Cristina Gutierrez watched in horror as her husband was read his rights and led away in handcuffs. "There's been a mistake," she kept saying. "Manuel would never hurt anyone." But in the interrogation room, confronted with Jerry Mitchell's detailed confession, Manuel Gutierrez broke down and told the truth. His version of events differed slightly from Jerry's. In Manuel's telling, the push had been more of a shove in anger, not an attempt to hurt Spence, just to get him to shut up for 5 seconds. He was being so annoying that day, Manuel said, as if this justified anything. "Going on, and I lost my temper for a second." But he confirmed the rest. Spence had fallen into the water, struck his head, gone under. Manuel had waited to see if he'd surface. When Spence's body appeared face down in the current, Manuel had made the calculation: help him and possibly fail, possibly get caught having caused this, ruin his own life. Or let the creek take him and tell no one. He'd chosen the latter. And he'd convinced a terrified 13-year-old Jerry to do the same. "I didn't think they'd ever find him," Manuel said. "The current would carry him to the river to the ocean. I thought he'd just be gone, missing. And yeah, that was terrible for his family. But what would the truth do? Bring him back? No. It would just destroy more lives. Mine, Jerry's, our families." Detective Webb felt sick. "So you let them search for 23 years. Let his parents die not knowing." Manuel looked away. "I know how it sounds. How you sleep at night." "Not well," Manuel admitted. "But I learned to live with it. And I built a good life. I have a family. I contribute to society. Would anyone be better off if I'd confessed back then? Spence would still be dead." The prosecutor who caught the case, Deputy DA Rachel Chen, had a different perspective. "This isn't about redemption," she told the press. "This is about accountability." Manuel Gutierrez, whether through intent or recklessness, caused the death of Spencer Fredrick. Then he obstructed justice, tampered with evidence by not reporting the death, and constructively imprisoned Jerry Mitchell in a conspiracy of silence for 23 years. He will answer for that. With Jerry's confession and Manuel's corroboration, search teams returned to Willow Creek. The location where Spence had fallen in was well defined. Both men described it identically, and it matched the topography. But 23 years had passed. The creek had shifted its course slightly. Vegetation had grown and died and grown again. The odds of finding remains were minimal. Still, they tried. Divers searched the creek bed. Ground-penetrating radar scanned the banks. Cadaver dogs worked the area. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the search live. On the third day, a diver named Patrick Corrales found something snagged in tree roots about half a mile downstream from where Spence had fallen in. A black JanSport backpack with a torn right strap, filled with silt and debris but still recognizable. Inside, waterlogged and degraded but present. A binder with Spencer Fredrick, Grade 8, written on the cover. A pencil case, the remnants of a brown bag lunch. They never found Spence's body. The best theory was that the October current had indeed carried him to the Santa Ana River, which had carried him to the Pacific Ocean. Gone, just as Manuel had predicted. But the backpack was enough. Physical evidence that Spence had been at the creek that day, exactly where Jerry and Manuel said he'd been. Enough to corroborate the confessions. Mabel Fredrick was 43 years old when Detective Webb called to tell her they'd found answers. She'd been without her brother for longer than she'd had him. The news hit her in waves, relief that she finally knew, rage at the men who'd stolen him and then stolen 23 more years of truth, grief that her parents had died without closure. "Can I see the backpack?" she asked. Webb brought it to her, still in an evidence bag. Mabel held it gently, crying. She remembered that backpack, remembered Spence throwing it on the floor every day after school, their mother yelling at him to hang it up. Such a normal, stupid thing. A backpack. Thank you, she told the detective. Thank you for not giving up. I didn't solve it, Webb said honestly. Jerry Mitchell solved it. He's the one who found the courage to speak. Mabel nodded slowly. Is there any way? Can I talk to him? The trial of Manuel Gutierrez began in June 2008. The charges were manslaughter, not murder. The prosecution couldn't prove intent to kill, only reckless behavior resulting in death. But they also charged him with obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and being an accessory after the fact. Jerry Mitchell testified for 3 days. He walked the jury through every detail of October 12, 1984. He wept openly on the stand. Defense attorneys tried to paint him as equally culpable, but the jury could see the difference. Jerry had been a frightened child, manipulated by an older, more dominant boy into keeping a terrible secret. Manuel had been the one to make the choice that mattered, the choice to let Spence die, to hide the truth. The defense argued that Manuel had also been just a child, that the push had been a momentary loss of temper with no intent to harm, that the decision not to report it was made in panic. They called psychologists who testified about adolescent brain development, about fear and trauma responses. But then, the prosecution played a recording that changed everything. After Manuel's arrest, detectives had obtained a warrant to record a phone conversation between Manuel and his younger brother, whom he'd called from jail. In that conversation, Manuel said something that undermined his entire defense. The thing is, Carlos, I'm not even sorry he's dead. Spence was always so fucking annoying. I just wish I'd been smarter about covering it up. The courtroom went silent. The jury's expressions hardened. Deputy DA Rachel Chen stood. Your Honor, the defense has argued that Mr. Gutierrez was a frightened 14-year-old who panicked. But that recording is from 3 weeks ago. That's a 38-year-old man saying he's not sorry a 13-year-old boy is dead, that he only wishes he'd hidden it better. That tells you everything you need to know about the defendant's character. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Manuel Gutierrez guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge gave him 15 years, the maximum allowed for manslaughter, plus the additional charges. You didn't just take Spencer Fredrick's life, the judge said. You took his family's peace. You stole 23 years of truth from people who deserved it. You traumatized Jerry Mitchell and forced him to carry your crime. And you've shown no genuine remorse. This court finds you deserving of every day you'll spend in prison. Manuel showed no emotion as he was led away. Cristina Gutierrez filed for divorce 3 weeks later. Epilogue. The Memorial. On October 12, 2009, 25 years after Spence Fredrick disappeared, Mabel Fredrick organized a memorial service at Willow Creek. The city had agreed to install a bench and a small plaque at the spot where Spence had fallen in. Jerry Mitchell came. He stood apart from the crowd at first, unsure if he'd be welcome. Mabel saw him, walked over, and took his hand. You gave my brother back to me, she said. Not his body, but the truth. That's what I needed. Thank you. Jerry wept. I'm so sorry. I should have told someone right away. I should have. You were 13, Mabel interrupted, echoing what she'd learned in her years as a psychologist. You were a child in an impossible situation, manipulated by someone you trusted. You're not the villain in this story, Jerry. You're another one of Manuel's victims. They stood together as the plaque was unveiled. It read, In memory of Spencer James Fredrick, March 15, 1971 to October 12, 1984. Forever 13. Forever loved. Forever missed. The truth may be delayed, but it cannot be destroyed. Detective Linda Vasquez, now 72 and retired, attended the memorial. She hugged Mabel and told her she'd never forgotten Spence. "He was always with me," she said. "Every case I worked, he was there, reminding me why it matters, why we can't give up." The sun set over Willow Creek, turning the water gold and orange. The small crowd, former neighbors, old classmates, people who'd searched that terrible night in 1984, stood in silence, remembering a boy who'd loved Star Wars and talked too much, and died because someone's temper flared for just a moment. Jerry Mitchell walked down to the water's edge. He knelt and placed a single stone on the bank, a Jewish tradition of remembrance that someone had taught him. "I'm sorry, Spence," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Behind him, Mabel watched. Her brother would never come home. Her parents would never know the truth they died seeking. But the silence had been broken. The weight that Jerry had carried for 23 years had been lifted, though the scars would remain forever. As darkness fell, the crowd dispersed. Mabel was the last to leave. She touched the plaque gently, then walked back up the trail toward Maple Drive, toward the house where she'd grown up, where Spence's room still waited in eternal 1984. She thought about the word closure. People always talked about closure, as if knowledge could seal a wound completely. But she'd learned that grief doesn't work that way. Knowing what happened to Spence didn't make him less dead. It didn't bring back the childhood that had ended the moment he didn't come home. It didn't restore the family that had slowly disintegrated in his absence. But it did one thing. It replaced the terrible uncertainty with terrible certainty. And somehow, paradoxically, that made it possible to breathe a little easier, to sleep without wondering, to finally, after 25 years, begin the real work of mourning. The creek flowed on as it always had, carrying water toward the river and the sea. Somewhere in its depths, silt and stone held secrets, still a shoe, perhaps, or fragments of blue windbreaker, or the bones of a boy who'd talked too much. But the biggest secret, the one that mattered most, had finally been spoken aloud. The silence that lasted 23 years was over. And Spencer Fredrick, wherever he rested now, could finally be at peace.